Top of the morning to you. Welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. The number of those hurt at the Ukrainian military funeral rises to 38, including 12 children. After Wagner mutiny, Putin says Russia united as never before. Plus, Lithuanian leader calls on allies to give Ukraine quick path to NATO after the war. Thank you so much for joining us. Ukrainian officials say at least 38 people, including 12 children, were wounded in a Russian missile strike targeted at a military funeral in the northeastern Kharkiv region on Tuesday. Television footage from the small town of Pervomaysky showed a 9-story residential building with smashed windows and black smoke pouring out. Mangled cars were in flames nearby, and a man sat in an ambulance with blood on his face. Regional Governor Oleh Syniehborov recalls that an Iskander missile had slammed into a residential quarter at about 1:35 p.m. Kyiv time. The apartments of about 2,000 people were damaged in the attack on the town. The youngest of the 38 people hurt in the attack was a child of 3 months. The child's condition is still unknown at this time. Public broadcaster footage showed about 100 people gathered at a funeral, some of them in uniform and some in civilian clothing, before the strike took place. Now, Maxim Zorin, a former commander of a fighting unit known as the Azov Battalion, that is now part of the Ukrainian army, says the town was hit as people gathered for the funeral of Oleh Fedinko, a soldier with the call sign Baby, who he said had been killed in combat near Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. Russia did not immediately comment on the attack and has denied deliberately targeting civilians in earlier encounters. A man and a woman have died in the morning shelling in the Ukrainian southern city of Kherson yesterday. In a statement, the local prosecutor's office say the number of wounded is being ascertained and damage to property has also been reported. Russian forces have continued shelling Kherson from positions they hold in the wider Kherson region, despite flooding caused by the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, which lies upstream from the city on the Dnipro River. Kyiv has reported making advances in southern Ukraine in a counterattack against the Russian forces, and both sides have reported heavy fighting in parts of the south. Meanwhile, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev put at about 185,000 the new recruits who joined the Russian army as professional contract soldiers since the start of the year. In a video posted on Telegram, Medvedev, who was earlier this year appointed to a role overseeing Russia's domestic military production, said that almost 10,000 new recruits had joined up in the last week after the mutiny by the Wagner Group mercenary organization was quelled and its fighters were given the option of signing on as regular soldiers. President Vladimir Putin is boasting that a Russian people united as never before has emerged after the short-lived revolt by the Wagner mercenary force. He thanked member states in a meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization for supporting Russian authorities during the brief mutiny mounted by Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin. Mr. Putin also accused the West of turning Ukraine into a virtually hostile state, anti-Russia. The summit presented an opportunity for President Putin to show he remains in control after the Wagner rebellion left some wondering about divisions amongst the Russian elite. According to him, in his words, the solidarity and responsibility for the fate of the fatherland was clearly demonstrated by the Russian political circle and the entire society by standing as a united front against the attempted armed rebellion. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky thanked the United States for its military support as the country celebrated its Independence Day on July the 4th. Addressing his American viewership, he said that Europe will not need your soldiers' participation in a bloody battle for freedom. He added that with U.S. support, Ukraine had ignited a new, powerful flame of liberty. The United States are Ukraine's most important military ally and a major financial support in the country's war against Russia.
Dear Americans, I congratulate you on the best day that life can bestow on any nation that rose up for freedom. I congratulate you on your Independence Day. Only the brave gain independence, and only the best of the brave are able to pass the freedom from generation to generation. Ukrainian love of freedom, with your support, has ignited a new powerful flame of liberty in our part of Europe, which will not go out and will ensure that tyranny will never again pass through Europe. And therefore, Europe will not need your soldiers' participation in bloody battle for freedom and the Ukrainian dream of living freely, when it is crowned with victory in the brutal and unprovoked war unleashed by Russia, will give fresh energy to the American leadership. Happy 4th of July, America. And please remember that in the coalition of the free and the brave, you can always count on Ukraine as your ally. Slava Ukraini!
President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Lithuania's president has urged NATO leaders to be bolder in addressing Ukraine's push for membership at a summit in his country next week, saying this will boost Kiev's battlefield performance, while Moscow will see any caution as weakness. In an interview, President Gitanas Nausėda advised NATO allies to disregard fears that bringing Ukraine into the US-led military alliance will provoke Russia, which invaded Ukraine on February the 22nd, 2022. Ukraine has been pressing NATO to declare at the July 11 and 12 summit that Kiev will join the alliance soon after the end of the war and to set out a roadmap to membership. But other members, such as the US and Germany, have been more cautious, wary of any moves that they fear could take the alliance closer to an active war with Russia, which has long seen NATO's expansion as evidence of Western hostility. The Lithuanian president says the host country expects provocations during and after the summit along its border with Belarus, where the Russian Wagner private militia has been offered refuge after its failed mutiny.
We all understand that right now, being in the midst of the war, Ukraine is not able to join NATO immediately. We understand that, Ukrainians understand that, but there is need to just create the corridor, procedures, algorithms, how to proceed if the war is over, or as we call, as conditions allow. I see that we are coming closer to each other in our positions. Yes, we have some countries which are cautious about the stronger wording on Ukraine's perspective, but even if we take these countries, I see some shift in mind of the leaders of these countries, and I expect very much that we still have about 1 week time in order to make the conclusions text as strong as possible. Our stronger wording on Ukraine's perspective for sure, it will increase the fighting spirit of Ukrainian soldiers on the battlefield. And this is a very important factor. I very much expect that the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, will come to Vilnius despite these rumors that if the wording will be weak or the decisions will be not bold enough, the Ukrainian president may consider the possibility not to go to Vilnius. I hope he will be here and he.
That was Gitanas Nausėda, the president of Lithuania. Now, Turkey expects Sweden to fulfill its commitment to address Ankara's security concerns as Stockholm seeks to join NATO. That's according to the foreign minister, Hakan Fidan. who, speaking at a news conference, said it is cause for concern that Sweden could not prevent provocations in the country. Sweden hopes to gain NATO approval from Turkey and Hungary by the July 11th, the 12th summit in Lithuania. Flights in and out of Moscow's Vnukovo airport were restricted yesterday morning for the technical reasons beyond the control of the airport, according to the Russian Federal Air Transport Agency. Restrictions were in place until 8 a.m. local time, and a number of flights were diverted to other airports. It was not immediately known whether the chances were related to a number of drones being intercepted early on Tuesday near Moscow. Russia said that Ukraine had attacked Moscow with at least 5 drones that were all either shut down or jammed, though one of the capital's main airports had to reroute flights for several hours. 4 Ukrainian drones were shut down by Moscow air defenses, while a 5th was jammed and crashed into the Oditsovo district of the Moscow region. Russia says no one was injured and other Moscow airports are functioning normally. We now speak to the deputy head, foreign desk, Pravda newspaper in Bratislava, Slovakia, Mr. Andrej Matisek. Thank you for being with us, and good morning.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Good to be back.
Do we see the Russian forces targeting Ukrainian locations outside traditional military facilities and military installations? We see in this case where those that were killed were at a funeral in Kiev, and before this, there was also a strike at a commercial district of some sort, a restaurant or cafe, where a number of civilians also lost their lives. So is this happening because the Russians say that they don't deliberately target civilians, but they are targeting military personnel who gather in these public spaces?
Look, I think this is, the Russians are still saying that they are not targeting civilians, but still civilians are dying, and being killed. Yes, you can probably find some soldiers almost everywhere in Russia, in Ukraine, because this country is defending itself against the Russian invasion. So does it mean that Russia can strike anywhere just because there is some uniformed personnel somewhere? It might be not even the uniformed personnel. There's maybe people in the military fatigue or whatever. So this is just a very lame excuse of the pattern we have been seeing basically from the beginning of the war. Russians are targeting civilians places. Russians are targeting civilians. I think what they wanna achieve at this part, to spread the horror of the war, maybe to somewhat suppress of the will of the Ukrainian people to fight back. But yes, in Kramatorsk, as you mentioned, there was the restaurant was targeted. Kramatorsk is basically on the front line. I'm sure there were some soldiers there. If this is really just an excuse, we have seen some soldiers there, so we are going to kill everybody. The quite famous young famous Ukrainian novelist Victoria Amelia died in this strike, just ordering pizza. I think this is just a very lame and horrible excuse of Russians it seems they don't care much about the human lives.
Yes, our condolences to the Ukrainian people over the death of Victoria Amelia, the novelist. I did recall that it's very sad that she passed away, and other people as well in that location. And speaking of that particular incident, the Ukrainians arrested a suspect who apparently they said was responsible for helping the Russians identify that location, some sort of pointer, some sort of a person who was there in that location to show where the missiles shall strike of some sort. So it appears that the Russians are using intelligence sources inside Ukraine to identify these locations and identify the fact that there are some military personnel that can be targeted. Does Ukraine have to be more careful?
Look, as I said, I think you can find soldiers in Ukraine at this moment almost everywhere. This is how it is. This is the country in the war. And as you mentioned, of course, I'm sure that the Russians are trying to use some sources also inside Ukraine. This is the way of the war. You can say, I'm sure that you will find some people in Ukraine who are sympathetic for various reasons, who are sympathetic to Putin's regime. I don't know, maybe they are just paid or whatever, or they have some connections to Putin's regime. We don't know that much about the case you just mentioned, that some guy was arrested who
Yes.
probably was really pointing out to some locations. But we also don't know to what locations he was pointing out, if this was the only one, if there were other locations. So it's very hard to judge what Ukrainians know, if this is a kind of a network or or just the individuals. Maybe we will see when we will know more in a few days, in the coming weeks.
Is it a concern for Ukraine? Should it be a concern for Ukraine that Medvedev announced the increase in the number of recruits that wanted to join the Russian army after the Wagner rebellion, which does it lend credence to the assertion of President Vladimir Putin that incident appears to have drawn Russians closer together?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting what we hear from Russia. You mentioned in the previous segment that Putin is saying that Russian people are now united more than ever, and everybody is just supporting basically him. Margaret Thatcher had a quote: "Being powerful is like being a lady. If you have to tell that you are, you aren't." I think this is a bit of a propaganda from the Putin's regime, saying, "Okay, everything is okay. Everybody calm down. Everything is under control." But I think just the fact that he feel need to say that, either Putin or Medvedev, to brag about how Russia is doing perfectly, I think it somewhat reflects a lot of uncertainties behind the curtains, I would say. So, but of course, the reality is that Russia has a lot of human power. It's hard to say. If those numbers former President Medvedev mentioned are really correct. But on the other hand, and this is somewhat related to what I said previously, this kind of disrespect to human lives from Putin's regime, they're just sending those troops to death, to battlefield. For what? To keep Putin in power. So unfortunately, I feel sorry for many of those Russians, many of those young people who are just recruited and sending to the battlefield, basically to death. As I said, we have seen what was happening in Bakhmut. They were just sending waves and waves of troops to try to achieve something. I don't think this is the responsible behavior towards own citizens. So yes, I think Ukraine is concerned about how many Russians can be sent to the front. But on the other hand, I found it quite horrible that the Putin regime in Moscow is willing to send more and more and more and more young people, and many of them will just die.
Yes, well, we should also keep in mind that many Russians, or a number of Russians, we don't know the number, also like to dodge the draft and the conscription, aside from the recruitment of these number of willing soldiers that has been announced by...
That's true. That's true. We have seen this during the phase of mobilization last year, when I think that we all have seen the lines of Russians just trying to leave Russia for Georgia, for Kazakhstan, for other countries. So I think this also shows that maybe I'm not saying that those people are I would say that trying to trying to do something about the war, but I'm sure they are trying not to be part of the war. Maybe just for of course, probably just for their personal reason. But they are showing that maybe regime is not that popular as Kremlin like to say.
What do you think President Putin means in that address where he mentions the unity of Russians, where he also says that the West is guilty of making Ukraine anti-Russia? I'm sorry, but that goes without saying. What do you think he means?
Yes, I have to laugh a bit because because it's kind of a tragicomical, I would say. You know, Russia started the war in 2014, annexed Crimea, stirring up tensions on the east of Ukraine. Last year, they started a large-scale invasion. Of course, Ukrainians are not happy about Russians. I would like to see a kind of a peaceful resolution, but I think the peaceful resolution is basically in the hands of Vladimir Putin. Just move out from Ukraine, and then we can talk, at least stop any kind of military activities, and maybe then we can talk. So if Putin is somewhat complaining that Ukrainians are suddenly not in front of Russians, I think he's the only person. He should blame himself. This is reality. I sometimes when I talk to my Ukrainian friends, it's not easy to talk to them because yes, some of them really feel a huge hatred against Russia. But what can I say? The Russia attacked their country. People are dying. Civilians are dying. So and yes, this is of Vladimir Putin's making.
Never was there a time such as now that the European Union seems to be united in the opposition to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which they call a special military operation. But the danger therein also is that this is going to make this a protracted conflict. You mentioned that you would like to see a peaceful resolution, but that depends on the withdrawal of the Russian troops from the borders and from all the locations that they have said they've annexed already, again, in Ukraine. But President Zelensky says he doesn't want it to become a frozen war. Do you think there is an argument for an armistice where both sides come together and say, no fighting for a season, no military endeavors for a period, so that we can bring back both parties to the negotiating table to avoid the further loss of life?
This is very tough one. It is. It could be. You know. I very much doubt it because again, I do believe that it should depend on Russia and it should depend on Kremlin. That trying to. It's very hard to believe to anything what Kremlin is saying, but I'm trying to give them still a little bit benefit of doubt, maybe, which some of my Ukrainian friends wouldn't be happy to hear. But yes, if Kremlin would be trying to be genuine about stopping any kind of military activities, like really stopping, maybe withdraw troops from some areas, then maybe I can imagine that also Kiev would be willing to talk. But it must be really a genuine effort, which I very, very much doubt that Kremlin is able and willing to do, because I think that most of Kremlin, if Kremlin would do this, I think that first of all, Moscow would be thinking, okay, now let's stop for a little bit and let's get more troops together and so on. So this is very, very complicated issues, and it is really not just about Kiev saying, okay, we want to talk. No, this is, the Russians started this war, and I think it's normal that we expect that some kind of efforts from Russia, which, and I think this is absolute total minimum, stopping any military activities and also withdrawing at least from some areas. I think this is absolute minimum. Maybe then it might create a little bit of space for something. But again, from my perspective, it's up to Russians.
And NATO has never been more visible than now in the scheme of things. And the man at the helm, Jens Stoltenberg, appears to be given a new lease of life with this one-year extension of his leadership to October 2024. Now, he's the one that Russia have a bone to pick, him and Ursula von der Leyen, over their hardline position, and as is to be expected because of the organizations they represent. But do you think that the extension of Stoltenberg's leadership of NATO bodes well for the alliance?
I think so. It's you can look at this from the maybe two different perspectives. One is that alliance NATO tried to find a successor of Mr. Stoltenberg, but it was there was kind of because there are so many pressing issues NATO is facing. I think that simply there was not enough time and maybe even not even enough effort to find somebody who would be will be willing to fill the quite a big shoes Mr. Stoltenberg is having, because he's there from 2014. He was a very one thing it should be mentioned. I think it should be emphasized. Mr. Stoltenberg is from Norway. Norway also had a border with Soviet Union, not just during the Cold War. And Norway was all the time the country. I talked to Mr. Stoltenberg at the beginning of June, and we have been discussing it. How to approach Russia, and he said that yes, of course, we have been trying for ages. My country, me as a prime minister, I've been trying to engage with Russia. And if you go to just few years ago, if you would go to north of Norway, there was a cross-border cooperation with Russia still. But Russia is simply behaving in a way this is unacceptable. And of course, especially the allies on the eastern flank, like my country, like Baltic countries, Poland, Romania, others, Black Sea, Bulgaria, and we are talking now about Black Sea region. Of course, they are concerned about what Russia is doing. So I think that giving Mr. Stoltenberg is giving a new mandate is for NATO. It's kind of obvious in the times of the crisis. Mr. Stoltenberg was also quite successful, maybe not perfectly, but quite successful of dealing with somebody like was American President Donald Trump, willing to talk to him, willing to listen to him, which is not always easy. So I think he's quite skillful in navigating the alliance during the time of crisis. So at the end, I think most of the countries just said, okay, there will be time to find a new face. But at this moment, it's easier just to stick with Mr. Stoltenberg, also because he's doing quite a good job.
And I also do not envy Antonio Guterres of the United Nations, Mr. Stoltenberg's contemporary, over the role the UN is playing. In the Charter, the UN Charter, the preamble states that aggression, I'm paraphrasing, is forbidden. Anything that tantamounts to the picking up of arms and invasions and what have you, post-World War, the Great War I and World War II, is forbidden. But Russia bypassed its position in the UN Security Council and bypassed all the votes by the General Assembly last year, and all the countries that voted against Russia and voted for Russia to immediately withdraw from their invasion of Ukraine. Russia bypassed all of that. Now, as far as the United Nations goes, what can they do except maybe beating a dead horse, and the horse has left the stable, the ship has left the harbor? What at this point can the United Nations do?
I think they can, publicly, you're absolutely right. Probably UN cannot do that much because we know that Russia is the member of the United Nations Security Council, is the veto power. So 5 countries, they cannot fear anything from the UN, basically, because they can still veto it. Of course, you have then you have the resolutions of the General Assemblies, but this is something which never quite work. Of course, this is a symbolically important. That's, I don't know how many countries are saying, okay, Russia should withdraw, but it's at the end, it's symbolic. What can maybe UN do and maybe General Secretary Mr. Guterres do is discreetly trying to opening channels to Moscow and Kiev and really trying to keep those channels open. So when opportunities arise that maybe there will be possible to talk at least about something, those channels will be open. So I think this basically some kind of a not very public diplomacy UN should try and Mr. Guterres should try, and I'm pretty sure that at least something is happening. So we will see. Maybe if there will be any opportunity to at least to ease the burden of the war to civilians, and so maybe UN can play some role. But publicly, yes, I don't think UN can do something. But some kind of discreet diplomacy, I think, would be wise, and maybe it's even happening. The fact that we don't know doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
Right. Diplomacy doesn't seem to be their forte right now, with the ICJ asking for Putin's arrest and other facets of the United Nations putting together situations where Russia can be held accountable. But thank you so much for your contribution this morning, Mr. Andrej Matisak, the Deputy Head, Foreign Desk, Pravda newspaper in Bratislava, Slovakia, for being with us on the program.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
After the break, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky warns Russia is the only danger to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Please stay with us. Welcome to the sophomore stretch of our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says Russia is the only source of danger to Europe's largest nuclear facility, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. In his nightly video message, President Zelensky said Russia was planning to simulate an attack on the plant occupied for a year by Russian troops. Ukraine and Russia have been accusing each other of plotting to attack the plant. The Ukrainian government accused Russia of planning a provocation at the Moscow-controlled Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, while Russia claimed that Kiev was planning to attack the facility. Kiev's military warned of the possible preparation of a provocation on the territory of the Zaporizhzhia power plant in the near future, while a Russian official says Ukraine, rather, is planning on attacking the plant on July the 5th, that is today, with high-precision, long-range weapons and drones. Fears about the safety of the nuclear plant, Europe's largest, have been constant throughout Russia's invasion, but increased in early June after the destruction of the Novokakhovka Dam, the source of cooling water for its reactors. Russia and Ukraine have regularly accused each other of putting the plant's safety at risk since the outbreak of the war in February 2022. Now, Russia claims there were certain contacts with the United States over the case of the detained Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovic, but that it did not want to make them public. The Kremlin made the remark a day after U.S. Ambassador Lynn Tracy was allowed to visit Gershkovic in a Moscow prison for only the second time. Hours later, the Russian embassy in the United States said its staff had visited Vladimir Dunayev, a Russian national who is in pre-trial detention in Ohio on cybercrime charges. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov was asked at his daily briefing if the timing of the two visits indicated that a negotiating process was underway. Russia has agreed in the past to high-profile prisoner exchanges with the United States, most recently last year when American basketball star Brittany Griner, sentenced in Russia on a drug charge, was exchanged for Viktor Bout, a Russian arms trafficker convicted in the United States. But it has said there could be no exchange involving Gershkovic until a verdict is reached in his case. no date has been fixed for his trial. Washington has said it is committed to bringing home Gershkovic and Paul Whelan, the former U.S. Marine who is serving a 16-year sentence in Russia for espionage. Washington has designated both men as wrongfully detained. Meanwhile, the spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry says proposals are set up a subsidiary of the Russian State Agricultural Bank for the purpose of the Black Sea grain export deal are unworkable. Maria Zakharova was commenting on a Financial Times report that the European Union had proposed a special subsidiary that could be connected to the SWIFT international payment system, which the bank has been cut off from. Russia has long threatened to pull out of the Black Sea grain agreement, complaining that promises to remove barriers to its exports of grain and fertilizer have not been fulfilled. In mid-May, Moscow agreed to renew the deal for 2 months, but has repeatedly said it sees no basis to extend it again this month when it expires. Now let's bring on board an expert on international relations theory from the Lagos State University, Dr. Dapo Thomas, speaking to us from the Lagos State University. Thank you for making out the time to be with us. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Lumde. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thank you. Now, we know that obviously there's no love lost between the Russians and the Ukrainians at the moment. But in the case of this nuclear power plant and the accusations from both sides that both sides want to attack the power plant, what possible use is this situation?
Well, you can see from all indications that Putin is the most desperate human entity that we have on earth now. So he can do anything. He can do anything just to ensure that this war ends in his favor. And I do not doubt the intel of, Ukraine intel that is likely to attack Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. The level of desperation also shows that that is not impossible. And I believe that as at now, if the United Nations or maybe the powers or maybe United Nations Security Council does not take a kind of preemptive decision against this, is going to be very catastrophic because nuclear power plant disaster is always very, very serious, always very, very serious. You remember this same Ukraine, you have one in Chernobyl in 1986, April 26. You have one, you had a nuclear power disaster in Chernobyl. Till today, Chernobyl is not occupied again because in fact, according to experts, it's going to take almost thousands of years because before human beings can even stay there again, before it can be rehabilitated. Although, well, some people, the villagers who survived let me put it in parentheses, the Holocaust of the nuclear disaster, are still staying around the villages, surrounding Chernobyl, around Chernobyl. But it's not something that we want. It's not something that is not preventable. This is avoidable. It's an avoidable disaster, and we have seen it coming right from the period of the war, because I think strategically, the Russians knew what they actually wanted, and they knew that occupying the Zaporizhia the nuclear part, which happens to be the largest in the whole of Europe, is going to be very strategic to them. So they occupy the place. They have some soldiers inside. In fact, they removed all the all the Ukrainian personnel, and then replaced them with their own soldiers. And well, they are still monitoring them. They are still there. But now that they have started removing them gradually, that caused for some suspicion on the part of Ukraine. And this was exactly what they did when they wanted to attack Kherson sometime last year. They pretended as if they were moving out, and then they left. So the Ukrainians now assume that they have liberated Kherson. But immediately they attacked that place. What they were doing was to move their own people away. So that's the same thing they are doing in Zaporizhia now, I mean, at the nuclear plant. And they have already cut off the dam, the Kharkiv dam, which they blew up recently. And then this is happening again. So I don't know, I'm not too sure of the date of the attack, but I'm so sure that if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And definitely Ukraine cannot attack its own nuclear power plant because it is it's not in their own interest to do that because they are the most, and they have more to lose in terms of, if there should be any destruction of that power plant, in terms of radioactivity that will happen around Ukraine, and then it's on their soil. So it's not for Russia to say that it was Ukraine that is trying to attack the power plant. I think that is that's it's a very serious, blatant lie. It's a blatant lie. I don't believe. I believe that if any attack is going to happen on the nuclear plant, it's going to be Russia, and they know that it's going to be a very catastrophic disaster for Ukraine.
Indeed, it'll be foolhardy for either side to think that any incident at that power plant, which the IAEA has been very stringent about trying to prevent, is going to leave any of both sides unaffected. But now to the Evan Gershkovic situation and his detention or his imprisonment in Russia. He's obviously been used as some sort of bargaining chip. Do you see that this situation will continue and he'll be released at any time soon?
No, I don't see him being released. Definitely, we go through the trial, and in almost 90, in fact, 100% cases, you will discover that most of the trials in Russia are always a kind of arranged trials. Why? Because even to their own citizens, you know the case of Alexei Navalny, you know the case of Kara-Murza. You know, these are trials that are, call them mock trials. Call them mock trials. So I don't see. That's why they now want to know to what extent they are going to do the kind of bargaining. You know, if there is going to be any bargaining at all, if there is going to be any exchange. You know, so that's why they are saying that the trial has to be concluded first before they can now know whether they are going to enter into any kind of agreement with the US. So anywhere in Russia, an American is an endangered species. So I just believe that the United States government should continue to tell its citizens that Russia should be a no-go area for them, because they are really subjecting them to serious blackmail from by the Russians. So the Russians are using them as a kind of bargaining chips to ask for the release of most dangerous elements, most dangerous spies that the US have in their possession. The US have in their possession. So it's going to be a continuous exercise. It's going to be a continuous exercise this kind of thing is going to be a continuous exercise for the Russians because they have more dangerous elements that the US has in their possession for now. So I don't see it being released anytime soon until maybe the judgment. In any case, they have even said it that the trial has to be concluded before they can enter into any kind of agreement with US.
Yes, we also understand that Ukraine seems to be happy or seems to be aware of a situation where there are more elements in Russia that could be approached by the CIA in the United States who want to turn against Russia by being intelligence or counterintelligence agents. But finally and very quickly, I know that Putin would love to recreate the Red Army of World War II, but with this new influx of soldiers who voluntarily joined the Russians' fighting forces after the debacle of Wagner, he says that Russia is unified now more than ever before. Do you agree?
No, definitely I disagree. How can you be talking of Russia being more unified or more united as more than as it was before the Wagner attack? No, Everybody saw what was happening, how the Wagner army were received. We saw the kind of joy, we saw the kind, even if it is just Rostodom and Vonores, but we saw that they were happy. We saw they were happy in Rostodom, we saw they were happy in Vonores, we saw that they have moved 200, from Rostodom to Moscow is 200 kilometers. They were 20 kilometers into Moscow before they reached an agreement with the Belarusian, with Lukashenko. So where is the unity? Where is unity? They shot down some of their planes and helicopters. So where is unity? Where is the unity he's talking about? They shot down their helicopters. And then you have a very top military man inside his own army and being a top person in Wagner group. So where is the unity? Within, there is no use. Everything has always been about coercion. Everything has always been about brutality. For Putin, everything has always been about desperation to hold on to power.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your contribution and your insight, Dr. Dakwa Thomas, who joined us from the Lagos State University. It's much appreciated.
You're welcome. Thank you, Olumide.
When we return, Ukrainian bid farewell to writer killed in Russian airstrike. That's in a moment. Please stay with us. The final stretch of the Russian invasion of Ukraine coverage, and Pope Francis's peace envoy for Ukraine, Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, is working on a mechanism that could ensure the return of children who Kyiv says have been abducted to Russia. He says we'll see how we can start the mechanism for the children and help as we have said on the humanitarian front, particularly the children that must be able to return to Ukraine, in his words. Speaking at a book presentation in Rome, he says he'd personally discussed the issue with Francis. The Italian cardinal visited Moscow last week and was previously in the Ukrainian capital. The Vatican had described his efforts as aimed at identifying humanitarian initiatives which could open roads to peace. Russian jeweler Sokolov have opened its first store in China, pivoting to Asia as access to Western markets dwindle. Sokolov had been planned to launch a retail network in Germany last year, but changed their plans after the Western markets shunned Russian businesses following Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Sokolov said in a statement that the shop in a Shanghai mall is the first part of a 3-store pilot project in China, making Sokolov the first Russian jeweler to enter China's offline retail market. Should the pilot be successful, the company plans to open another 30 to 50 stores in China within the next 2 to 3 years. Sokolov also plans to list its shares on the Moscow Stock Exchange in the second half of the year. Now, for the impact of the war on businesses around the world, Ini John Mekwa, our business correspondent, joins us. Ini, good morning.
Good morning. Cuba.
There was an exchange between the Cuban envoy and the Russian envoy where they said that they were inviting President Putin to be in Cuba, but knowing that they had some sort of visit from the Cubans a little over a year ago, they said they're not in a hurry to do that. But that means that Cuba and Russia seem to be on very good terms.
Very good terms.
But is there an impact on the Cuban economy?
Obviously, a lot of impact. So the thing with the Cuban economy is it has been in a downward state for a while now. They were very much hit by COVID-19 because they thrive on tourism. And now with COVID-19, we know what happened. A lot of traveling and all of that were cut off. And I know countries or individuals didn't even have enough finances to take care of their basic needs. So going for holiday was a big deal, not to mention going to a country like Cuba. So it's really been a big hit, and they have not recovered from that. So that meeting you talked about, where Cuba went to Russia, they had some agreements, signed some MOUs that are supposed to help resuscitate their tourism, their agric, help them produce steel and agricultural produce and, energy. oil and gas, because they also depend on imported refined crude oil for petrol, especially. So these are the areas that they agreed on now. One of the things that the war has done, because in Cuba, you know, Russia used to do their local, although they used to have some components from outside the country, Lada vehicle. That's the car that they are now using since the Western countries stopped.
That little car?
Yeah, yeah.
That's that mini car.
Mini kind of full car. So you have a lot of that in Cuba. But because of the war and the issue of logistics and insurance, moving things, the issue of spare parts has become a very huge problem for them. You know, do things with cars. You need some plugs here, you need to change the brake, you need to do this and all of that. Now, getting those things have become really hard and expensive for a lot of the car owners in Cuba. And getting it in is not. And then don't forget, because of the downward trend of the economy, because of tourism and all of that, the government is not that buoyant, you know, to be able to import things easily into the country. So that's one impact that Cuba is facing from the war. Now, Russia has promised, one of the agreement they had, has promised to be supplying them 30,000 barrels a day of petrol. And of course, Russia is looking for markets now. But how will Cuba keep paying for that is another problem, because economic activities have really dwindled in Cuba, and obviously revenue has dwindled. So, you know, how are they going to keep paying for all of that? That's also another problem that they will have to face. And even the infrastructure for tourism and agri that they have agreed to do, certainly Russia will want to gain something from it. What will Cuba be able to offer to Russia?
I hope we will have more on business news after this program, not necessarily about Cuba and Russia.
Yeah.
John Mekwa, much.
Thank you so much.
Many thanks.
Yeah.
Finally, on the program, cheerful mourners filled one of central Kiev's main cathedrals yesterday to honor a prominent Ukrainian writer and war crime researcher killed in a Russian missile strike in a cafe in eastern Ukraine. 37-year-old Victoria Amelina died on July the 1st from injuries sustained from the June 27 attack, which killed 12 others when Russian forces hit a restaurant packed with civilians in the frontline city of Kramatorsk. She was an award-winning writer and novelist who also began researching Russian atrocities after the Kremlin's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Colleagues described her, Amelina, who was born in the western city of Lviv, as fiercely dedicated to seeking justice and promoting Ukraine's cause on the international stage. A wide array of writers, journalists, and other public intellectuals streamed into the Golden Dome St. Michael's Cathedral to pay their tribute. Relatives and friends broke down in tears as they filed past Amelina's coffin. Our condolences to all concerning the casualties suffered in this conflict. And that's where we leave it for today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you for watching. Thanks to our producers and our guests, and of course to you, our viewers. See you again.